there.
The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Para-X, its affiliates, or its sponsors.
Get a little closer. Testing. 1, 2, 3.
Step outside of your comfort zone. See the world with a whole new perspective. Join us and experience the unexplained on the Paranormal View.
And welcome everybody right here to the Paranormal View on the Para-X Radio Network. I want to thank everyone for being with us tonight. Those here in the chat room and those listening from around the world, we appreciate each and every one of you. Tonight we got a great show lined up, and there's a lot to it, so we're not going to waste too much time going into different things. I just want to remind everybody, if you do have questions tonight, you can private chat them to H. Foister or Ceiling Cat, and we will get those answered for you. So with that, we got with us tonight Barbara Duncan.
Good evening, everyone.
And we have Jeffrey Gould.
Hello, hello.
And we got a great guest lined up tonight. I'm excited. So you guys might as well strap on because we're taking a trip. So with
tonight,
go ahead, Jeff.
I was just going to say, a certified practitioner of regression hypnosis and quantum healing hypnosis techniques. Our guest tonight is Kathleen Marden, who's a leading ufologist who since 1990 has been researching UFOs and the perplexing nature of UFOs and their non-human entities associated with highly advanced aerial vehicles. Her research has extended to archival collection and the U.S. government's involvement in investigating UFO and its major studies. Her interest in UFOs and contact began in 1961 when her aunt and uncle, Betty and Barney Hill, had their famous close encounters and subsequent abduction in New Hampshire's White Mountains. She spent 15 years in painstaking investigation of the Hill abduction case and continues to seek the scientific analysis of the compelling evidence. She's the author and collaborator of 5 books. Kathleen has worked on 3 comprehensive studies on nearly 5,000 experiencers, 2 of which she initiated and saw to the end. So welcome, Kathleen Marden with an M. Sorry.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening.
I guess one of the main things, I mean, there's tons of stuff other than just this to talk about, but you did write the book or co-authored the book of Captured.
Absolutely.
And it went into so much detail. I mean, it's told the story completely different than what most people just normally hear. I mean, you went into depth.
Yes, and I wanted to separate fact from fiction. Back in the 1980s, I was reading newspaper articles, magazine articles, watching television shows that were telling the story of what happened to my aunt and uncle differently than I remembered it. And I thought, is it my memory or is somebody fabricating information? And so I just slowly and methodically began my research and investigation. I did as thorough an investigation on the case as I could, going along the close encounter route with my aunt time after time. I'd drive her up there from Portsmouth and then would return home the same day. I drove along there with my husband. My husband and I even took the trip that Betty and Barney took on in September of 1961 from Niagara Falls up through Toronto, stopping about 112 miles west of Montreal, spending a lovely afternoon in Montreal, and then driving on the same old roads that Betty and Barney drove on. They were the highways then. We didn't take the new highways. We wanted to follow this route precisely the way Betty and Barney did. See the things that they saw. Stop at the restaurants they stopped at. And that's what we did. And I think that I did the most thorough investigation I could. I interviewed Betty time and time again, playing devil's advocate. Eventually, she gave me her entire archival collection. I'm the executrix and trustee of her estate anyway, so I prepared an archival collection at the Milne Special Collections Library at the University of New Hampshire. Betty and I are both graduates from UNH, so the archival collection is there. I also have my own copy of everything, and I even interviewed the original investigators who were still alive. So I did a tremendous amount of research over many years, attempting to separate fact from fiction. I wanted to know if Betty's dreams were precisely the same as the hypnosis sessions that she and my uncle Barney had. So I transcribed the hypnosis sessions. And I wasn't a very good typist in those days. It took me a long time. But by the time I finished, I think I'd just about memorized their statements under hypnosis with Dr. Benjamin Simon. So we can get into all of that in greater detail, but I'm going to give you a chance to ask me some questions.
All right.
So you mentioned that she had an archive of the research that she was doing. Was it similar to Spielberg's Close Encounters, where at post-abduction it kind of became an obsession of trying to figure out what happened to her, and that she was doing her own research to try to figure it out?
No, she really was not. That was not part of the collection. What was part of the collection is the original investigative reports, letters to and from scientists. There was information that I wasn't even aware of because it had remained confidential at the request of the scientists who took part in it. And I have chapters in Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience on that as well. There were the scientific reports from the early analysis of the evidence, and just a wealth of information. The Air Force Project Blue Book reports, the reports written by Walter Webb, who was an astronomer at the Hayden Planetarium, who was the original investigator for the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. And I had met him several times and finally went to his home and interviewed him, and he gave me some of his files that were not in Betty's files. So that was really a great experience and contributed a lot of information that I didn't have. So Betty, later on in life, wanted to learn more about UFOs and ETs, and she spoke to many individuals who believed that they had been abducted, but she was highly skeptical of anyone who did not have the level of evidence that she had. And then some of these scientists asked her to take part in CE5 experiments, which are experiments where she attempts to call in craft. And she went a little bit overboard with that and continued to do it, and sometimes left the scene because she became frightened, but it's recorded in her notes that she believed she had seen a craft. She received a lot of criticism for that, I can tell you that. And it's all in the book.
So she, on her own, went out and tried to communicate.
Eventually, first she was doing it with scientists, and they were actually scripting her and gave her instructions on precisely what she was supposed to do. This was Robert Homan and C.D. Jackson, who worked for IBM engineers. And so they scripted her. They were also members of NICAP and were doing a paper, a presentation, and wanted to speak with her. They spoke with her in November of 1961, and it was after the hypnosis when they decided that they wanted to attempt these experiments with Betty. They had asked her to please contact them if she and Barney ever decided to have hypnosis and actually had it. So she was back in touch with them, and they talked her into carrying out this experiment, which she did. As I said, they scripted her, and she and Barney would go to my grandmother's house first. I lived across the street from my grandmother's house when I was a child with my parents and my two brothers. And Betty lived about 20 miles away. She was in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and we were down in Kingston, a little bit inland, but fairly close to the coast. And so she would ask Kraft telepathically, night after night after night. She would try to be in contact with those entities who had abducted her and ask them to show their craft on my grandparents' farm, and then ask them to land their craft on my grandparents' farm. They saw them, other people saw the craft, and there were at least 2 landings on my grandparents' farm. There was physical trace evidence left behind, and at least one of those was investigated by NICAP.
Okay.
But when
And
they landed,
people who,
when they
go ahead,
landed,
Jeff.
nobody came out, though, right?
Not that they could see. My grandmother was very frightened. She was one who saw the craft landing. A neighbor of ours was a commercial pilot, and he was returning home from work that night, and he saw the craft coming in too. So 2 people observed that craft. It left physical trace evidence on the ground. It splayed out some trees, sheared off some part of a tree, and left a landing spot that it looked like a craft had landed there. There were markings on the ground where this landed.
So when you were growing up with this, exactly how much was shared with you at the time? Were you trying to be shielded from it, or were they actually explaining to you, hey, something happened to your aunt and uncle?
Well, I was 13 years old when my aunt and uncle had their experience, and when they arrived home on September 20th, 1961, Betty called my mother. She and Barney had felt that they had been contaminated. When they arrived home, they felt very dirty. They said they felt clammy. The craft had come so close that they were afraid that they had been exposed to radiation. They were afraid that perhaps they would have radiation poisoning. They took long showers to try to wash away anything that they might have been exposed to. And they sat down and they drew what they remembered observing that night. It's in my book, Captured. And also, they decided to have a nap. They decided to sleep a few hours. So when Betty was on the phone with my mother, I had returned home from school in the afternoon, and my mother was on the phone with Betty, and I was listening just to my mother as part of the conversation. Betty wanted my mother to contact our neighbor who was a physicist and to ask him what she and Barney should do They were afraid, of course, that they'd been contaminated. And so my mother did call that physicist, and he suggested that if they had a compass, they should take the compass out to the car and see how the needle reacted. Now, that is not going to test for radiation. It will test a magnetic field. She did go out to the car, and she saw new shiny spots on the paint that hadn't been there the day before. And she placed the compass over those spots, and the needle whirled, indicating there was a magnetic field there. But when she moved the compass down to the side of the car, the needle just behaved normally, the way it should have. So she showed this to Barney. She showed it to the people who lived upstairs from them. Betty and Barney owned an apartment house and lived in it. And within 2 days of hearing about this, my family and I drove the 20 miles up to Betty's and Barney's house, and we had the opportunity to see those spots for ourselves. And I had the opportunity to listen firsthand to Betty's story of what she remembered about the craft that came down so low. And she even handed her watch to me that was no longer working. I have that watch now, and it reads 5:15. So I think that what happened is that they had checked their watches at a little after 10 o'clock that night as they were driving through upstate New Hampshire. They'd stopped for a cup of coffee, and they wound the watches. And when they arrived home in the morning, neither watch was working. So they wound them up and they set them to the time that it was when they arrived home. And so that's why the watch still reads 5:15, because those watches were broken. They never worked again.
So after the abduction and they got back home, was there a part that they kind of like had pushed out of their minds to where they didn't realize that they had been abducted?
Well, let me tell you what they remember just before the abduction. The conscious recall that they had was of having at least an hour of driving with that craft coming in closer and closer. And they stopped 2 times. And then it was coming in very close. And Betty wanted Barney to stop the car again. But before he could find a place to stop, the craft surged ahead and descended to within 200 feet of the road. And Barney then had to stop the car in the middle of the road so he wouldn't be directly underneath the craft. And he opened the door. Barney was a skeptic. He did not think this was possible. And he opened the door hoping that he was going to identify it as some kind of conventional aircraft. But there it was, like a big pancake, he said, hanging there silently in the air. And he stepped away from the car to get a better look. He had his binoculars to his eyes, and when he did, the craft shifted to an adjacent field and descended even lower to within 100 feet of Barney. He was still looking at it through binoculars. He walked toward it. He had the binoculars up to his eyes, and he was shaking his head, and he was saying, "I can't believe it. This is impossible. I can't believe it." And he'd take the binoculars down and shake his head, and still he'd put them up, and the craft was there. And through the binoculars, he saw what he remembered, never forgot, as figures dressed in black, shiny uniforms. And this was written, I know this is a fact because it was written in the report to the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena only a few days later. So as he's watching these non-human entities, he knew they were somehow not human, but he was so shocked that he had forgotten what their faces looked like. And so all but one turned in unison and walked to what appeared to be a panel on the back of a circular hallway around this craft. And he could now see them from the tops of their heads to their knees. And he saw arms go up. And when that occurred, little red lights started to slide out from each side. And that craft, I mean, it wasn't a rectangle or anything. It was an oval craft or a circular craft. But two lights came out. And then when that happened, something started to drop down out of the bottom of the craft. He thought it was a rope. Today we know it's not a rope. It is a kind of carrier beam that comes down a little bit at a time, and the entities come down on that beam and move the human up into the craft. So anyway, Barney at this point worried that they had a plan for him, and that plan was to capture him, he said, quote, like a bug in a net. And at that point, he became terrified. He pulled the binoculars away from his eyes and ran screaming back to the car, telling Betty that they had to get out of there or they were going to be captured. That's where the name of my book came from. As he was getting into the car door had been left open. As he was getting in, he noticed that the craft was now coming in his direction. He went speeding down the highway, trying to outrun the craft if it was indeed over the car. He told Betty to roll down her window and look up, and she did. But all she saw was blackness. Even though it was a bright light night, she was looking for the lights on the craft. She later realized that the craft was right over the car. And then, momentarily, she and Barney heard a series of code-like buzzing sounds striking the trunk of the vehicle. They caused the car to vibrate. It was a 1957 Chevy Bel Air, blue and white, and it caused a tingling sensation to pass through Betty's and Barney's bodies. The next thing they knew, they were 35 miles down the road with very little memory of what happened in the interim. They remembered finding themselves on a dirt road with tall trees all around. They remembered being stopped by a roadblock, and they remembered a fiery orb sitting on the ground, a large one, but they didn't know where or when that occurred precisely. And then they heard a second series of buzzing sounds, and they returned to full consciousness. They didn't see the craft this time. And then Betty said to Barney, "Now do you believe in flying saucers, Barney?" And he said, "Oh, Betty, don't be ridiculous. I'll prove to you that I can make that sound with this car, that buzzing sound." And so he stopped the car and he drove it from one side of the road to the other, and he could not produce that sound. They drove on home. They were seeking human comfort. Barney was looking for a police officer. He wanted to report this. They wanted a cup of coffee if they could find a restaurant that was open, but nothing was open. And they just drove on home, anticipating an arrival sometime between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. As I said, the watch said 5:15. They arrived very close to 5:15 a.m.
Wow. So you think the
Huh.
watch didn't stop until after they got home then?
Oh no, the watch
Oh no,
stopped,
yes,
I think, when when the craft was over the car,
Huh.
and they were wind-up watches.
Huh.
So I think that the powerful magnetic energy from the craft, the magnetic field, caused those watches to spring, sort of. You know, there were springs inside of them.
Wow.
and it's fascinating too that you talk about the magnetic spotches that were on the car itself. The very fact that it could be so directed that it wouldn't shut out or corrupt the rest of the car and cause it not to function.
Right.
I
They
mean,
they finally did cause the car not to function, but that was revealed through hypnosis. When
okay.
Betty and Barney arrived home, they remembered the part that I've already mentioned, but then there was evidence that something very strange had happened to them. Torn clothing, tops of Barney's shoes were so deeply scraped that he had to buy new shoes. The binocular strap was severed. All of these mysteries that they couldn't explain. And this really started to bother Barney. Betty was just very curious. She went to the Portsmouth Public Library and took out the first book she had ever read on the topic. And that is how she got the address for NICAP. In the book, there was an address and a request to write to them if anyone had a UFO sighting. So they did that. That day that that Betty was on the phone with my mother, the chief of police from a neighboring town, who happened to be my father's best friend and stopped by every night for coffee at about 5 o'clock or so, advised Betty and Barney to make a report to Pease Air Force Base. He said that Project Blue Book from Pease Air Force Base had gotten in touch with the police station and asked them to have people file reports with them if they had UFO sightings. So that's what they did. They were good citizens just trying to do the right thing. You know, Betty was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire. Barney worked for the post office. They were active in the civil rights movement. He was black, she was white. He was raised in Virginia and Philadelphia. She was raised on a farm in New Hampshire. And they came together. They met back in 1956 in Hampton, New Hampshire.
Well, that really kind of mentally upset Barney. He never could get past or get over it to where he could, I guess, function real good.
He had difficulty with that. I think it's because he was the one who had the conscious, continuous recall of observing those non-humans looking down at him, feeling that he was going to be captured, and not knowing what was going to happen next, having this evidence that something that he couldn't explain had happened. He had not believed it was possible before it occurred, and he ended up having so much difficulty over all of this that he developed post-traumatic stress disorder. That's what we call it today. He had developed bleeding ulcers, high blood pressure. He had a tremendous amount of difficulty over all of this. He just wanted to forget about it, to let it go. Even before Betty called my mother, he said, "Betty, let's not ever tell anyone about this because no good can come of it." And so that was his plan, but that wasn't Betty's plan. She walked to the phone and phoned my mother.
Wow.
So Barney basically was exhibiting the same type of behavior that most assault victims would behave.
Yes, absolutely. And this is the reason why he was referred to Dr. Benjamin Simon. Dr. Simon was a neuropsychiatrist, and during World War II, he was a colonel in the Army, and he set up the psychiatric unit at the Mason General Hospital on Long Island. And he had a tremendous amount of success in working with veterans or soldiers who were coming back from the war and had physiological symptoms that were psychogenically induced. And other psychiatrists were not as successful as Dr. Simon. He developed a method to get to the truth, to get to the precise thing that caused this physiological symptom, this conversion hysteria is what they were calling it back then. And so there was a movie even made about his work, Let There Be Light. It was a John Huston propaganda movie, and you would see a soldier go into his office who was wheeled in a wheelchair because he couldn't walk. And Dr. Simon did therapy with him and said, okay, stand up and walk. And the soldier still was not able to walk. And Dr. Simon got to the precise cause. There would be always something else, not just that one event, but other things in that person's life that all contributed to that. In this case, he wasn't able to walk. When Dr. Simon had finished his hypnotherapy with this soldier, you could see him playing baseball and running the bases at the end of the movie, and then getting on the bus to go home to his family. So Dr. Simon was amazing. He was at the top of his field. He taught at Harvard. He taught at Yale. And he at one time had owned his own private psychiatric hospital as well. And so he was the perfect person for Barney to see. He did not believe that UFOs were real, but that was okay because Barney was his patient being treated for a medical condition. And Betty just happened to go along with him and asked to be hypnotized as well. So Dr. Simon agreed that he would see them, and he would see them separately. One would wait in the waiting room, which was soundproof and had very loud music playing, while the other one was in Dr. Simon's office in deep hypnosis, reliving the events that occurred, dating all the way back to their decision to make this trip until after they arrived home from that trip and for the next day or two. And he saw them separately. He reinstated amnesia at the end of each session so that they could not speak to each other about what they had remembered and contaminate one another's information. He wanted the separate story from each of them.
Wow. Now, I know that a lot of people that had been abducted apparently is re-abducted once, twice, 3 times. And had Barney and Betty ever been re-abducted that they would have known about?
Well, Barney, I am not sure about. My mother thought that he might have been because he was down behind my grandparents' house on the farm. He always liked to walk the backlands of the farm. when they would come down from the small city of Portsmouth, and which was about once a week, sometimes twice. And they weren't able to find him one day, but there was a craft scene down there. So we don't know if he was or not. Let me put it that way. For Betty, there is evidence in later hypnosis tapes that I have with Dr. James Harder. Dr. Harder was the leading abduction researcher in the United States back in the 1960s and 70s. And he worked for the APRO, for the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, that was headed up by Coral and Jim Lorenzen. They were located in Tucson, Arizona. And so Dr. Harder had hypnotized Betty. I knew him, he's now passed, but he would visit and sometimes I was gone. I was off with my first husband to graduate school in Cincinnati, and I was going to graduate school part-time while he was full-time. And then I was in Colorado after that, but I would travel back to New Hampshire frequently on vacation. I was close to my family, so I saw Jim Harder when I would go back sometimes, and then when I moved back to New Hampshire in the early to mid 1980s, Dr. Harder also came to visit. He was hypnotizing Betty, and he worked with other members of the family as well.
Wow.
Yeah, and there's one sentence in this book that really just sort of gave me chills, and that was when Betty was talking with evidently the leader, and she was asking him, if you decide to come back and get me, how are you going to do that? And his comment was that that if they made the decision to find me, they would. They always knew how to find people.
Yes, they always knew how to find those they were looking for. He was escorting Betty from the craft. They'd already taken Barney down, but she was really angry because she wanted to keep a souvenir as evidence that it happened. And they wouldn't let her keep it, and she was refusing to leave without it. But she finally gave up. The leader escorted her down that path, and she invited him back to speak with people who had more knowledge than she had. And so she had said to him, he said, "I don't know, it's not my decision to make." And he said, "Maybe I'll be able to come back." And she said, "Of all the people on this world, how will you be able to find me?" And he said, "We can always find those that we want to find." So, it makes me wonder, maybe Betty had an implant. Maybe this was not Betty's first time. But,
Yeah.
I didn't consider those things. Well, I considered the implant, but when she was alive, toward the end of her life, but she refused to have an autopsy so that they could look for an implant and remove it. So that was the end.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, when you stop and think of even that, and still she was so brave, in my opinion, because she really wanted to know what the heck they were about, and not feeling so much like a victim, which I found really amazing.
Betty was a very brave woman. Let me give you an example. She was a social worker who worked in child welfare and adoption, and ended up being promoted to the position of supervisor. But one of her foster children, a teenage girl, was holed up in a hotel or a motel room with her boyfriend, who was an escaped criminal. And the police were outside, guns drawn, trying to talk this girl out. And so Betty got on the bullhorn and said to her in no uncertain terms, "I'm getting tired of waiting out here for you. Get dressed and get out of that motel room right now." And sure enough, Betty walked up to the door, and the girl came out, and Betty took her back to the foster home. That's how brave she was.
Wow.
She's tough.
She was.
I could see her going up against an alien saying, yeah.
She would go up against anyone.
Well, that's kind of evident because she was talking to the people in the spaceship.
Yes, when she lost her fear of the leader, she did. Before that, she was terrified. She told me that there was one of the little guards who are about 3.5 feet tall. They're the typical grays. They might not even be sentient beings. Their heads are much larger in proportion to their bodies than the taller grays, who are about 4.5 to 5.5 feet tall. They only move when told to do so. He was on guard outside the examining room as she was being examined, and terrified him, or he terrified her. She closed her eyes through a lot of it because she didn't want to look at him. The taller ones were more human looking, but not human, resembled more of an Asian looking individual, but they were completely hairless. They did not have external ears. They had a slit for a mouth, fairly large slanted eyes that rounded around to the sides a little bit, and all communication, as far as I know, from what I've gathered from talking with Betty and listening to the hypnosis tapes too, where Dr. Simon asked about that, is that communication was telepathic. But Betty understood the one that she called the examiner, who was more like a physician, and to have an accent. And when they opened their mouths to speak with one another, she and Barney actually did hear a sound that was more like a mumming or a humming kind of sound.
Which is probably the way that they really communicated. It's fascinating that somebody can come back and tell things like that. There has supposedly been all kinds of abductions, but not many people, I guess, are able to come back and describe things like the way that she has.
Well, she didn't remember being on the craft and what happened there. I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear. They remembered everything that I said up until the time they arrived home, and after that, from the beginning of their trip. But the part that they didn't remember, that was sandwiched in between those conscious memories, was the part where they were abducted by these non-human entities, taken to craft. Barney's shoes were scraped when he felt like he was floating, but he felt like he was being supported, although he couldn't feel. He was so numb, he couldn't feel the hands supporting him, and only the toes of his shoes were bumping along the rocks. Betty was being escorted, and when they were ready to take her onto the craft, she fought for her life. That's another example of how brave Betty was. She kicked the entity next to her, and in doing that, she tore the hem on her dress down and tore the lining from waist to hemline. She was fighting for her life, and then they pointed something at her and regained control of her.
Hmm.
So, yeah, so what happened on the craft is what was revealed through hypnosis with Dr. Benjamin Simon. And Betty and Barney saw him for hypnosis sessions every Saturday for about 4 months. And then he saw them together, and he played the tapes back to each of them. Then that is when he did therapy to help them to integrate this information into their conscious minds, and to be able to accept this emotionally and go on with their lives.
Wow. You know, I guess a lot of people that are abducted goes through things like this.
Yes, they do.
Why do you think that the aliens are just over and over and over doing this to people? What are they looking for?
Well, I have taken part as a researcher in 3 major studies on experiencers. The first study, we had a control group, 2, of people who were not experiencers. The second study was done with the Edgar Mitchell FREE Foundation, and I am on their board of directors and also a research consultant with them. So I helped to write the questionnaire, experiencer questionnaire, and they had 3,200 people when the scientists who were involved evaluated and did a statistical analysis on the evidence. And then I did a 3-year study through MUFON's experiencer research team with Dr. Don C. Donderi. And Dr. Donderi was a psychologist, a research psychologist at McGill University in Montreal during his professional career. He has had a long-standing interest in UFOs and contact. And also I had Dr. Michael Austin Melton on the team. Craig Lang and also Denise Stoner were on the team who took part in this survey, writing it. I did, and Dr. Donderi and Stanton Friedman all did statistical analysis. And I wanted my work checked to make sure it was accurate. So they looked it all over for me. So why are people taken time and time again? Let's back up a little bit, because one of the things that we wanted to determine is, what is this generational? Does it run in families? And is it intergenerational? And we discovered that 50% of the experiencers overall, everyone who took part in the survey, said they were aware of other family members who had been taken, and 60% of the group of abductees. And that was determined through interviews and through Dr. Donderi, who administered and the American Personality Inventory. And that was developed to determine if a person had UFO abduction syndrome. So they had the knowledge and the emotional signature of having been abducted. And so 60% of the abductees were aware that this ran in their families. And why are they taken time and time again? 54% of our group had been taken 4 times that they were aware of. 24% remembered only one time, and 10% remembered more than 50 times. That's hard for me to believe that they were actually taken that many times. It could have been a mistake, or it could have been a visitation by negative entities and not ETs, negative interdimensionals. But yes, they're taken time periodically, and the information that we received on the open-ended questions, both through FREE, and through MUFON's experiencer survey, is that these entities are concerned about humans. They are doing studies. They're doing genetic studies. We know that they have had a hybridization program ongoing from probably the 1950s, from the cases that I have investigated. And they are looking for an upgrade in humanity. With the experiencers, they want to make certain changes in humans so that we will be less primitive, because they're extraordinarily concerned that we will have a nuclear war and there will be an environmental collapse. They say it's happened on other planets. They say that our technological development is out of sync with our spiritual growth. And they are attempting to raise spirituality among humans in order to try to save this planet, because they have told people that they have seen life end on other planets, terrible environmental collapses, and they don't want that to happen again. Major General John Alexander Samford was at the Pentagon in 1952, and he called a press conference. This was the largest press conference since the end of World War II. And he and others spoke to people all across the United States who were so interested in the UFOs seen over Washington in July of 1952. And Major General Samford began his speech with a statement. And what he said is, these phenomena date back to biblical times. In our past, they have come back about one time every 100 years. And he said, but they came back in this century and they didn't go away. And he said the Air Force is studying this carefully and conservatively. We're not going to be too upset about this. It's going to be very methodical. But what he was saying is, this has been going on for a very long time. So these entities have told experiencers that they have had a long-term interest in our planet, and they stayed here because we had developed nuclear capabilities. They eventually saw that we were capable of going out into space, and they certainly, I believe, would want to protect themselves from humans whose major activity is tribal warfare. We killed nearly 200 million of our own kind during the 20th century in major and minor wars and the starvation that came with the wars. So they have seen a lot occurring on our planet. They're generally around watching and sometimes intervening in wars that we've been involved in. They were in Vietnam. They've been in the Middle East. And so they have a real interest and worry in human behavior.
So, in your estimation, when people tell you that they have seen grays or other types of extraterrestrials, is it an indication that they have been abducted, or is it sometimes just random sightings?
Well, there are some individuals who have seen the non-humans through the windows of craft and who believed they had not been abducted, but did not want to explore that any further. So let me throw in that little caveat. But for the most part, if a craft comes within 500 feet or less away from an individual, it's generally there to pick them up. We asked, have you observed craft at 500 feet or less? Among the experiencers overall, they said it was 65%. Among the abductee group, 70%. And this carried through to their families too. The families had observed these craft.
Wow.
What we have discovered in our study is, and it agrees with the academic research that has been done on experiencers, particularly the Omega 1 and 2 studies that were done at the University of Connecticut. And experiencers not only become more spiritual, 95% of the abductee group, 69% of the experiencers overall, but they become more psychic or intuitive at a very high percentage. They become empaths, where they can feel another person's emotions. And I've thought about that. The best way that an extraterrestrial can change a human is to cause that human to feel the pain that they cause to other humans, or that they inflict on other humans. You won't want to harm other humans if you feel their pain. And that is clearly the result of our research. This is occurring at such a high percentage, it cannot be ignored.
Uh,
Go ahead.
okay, so I have taken one of the questionnaires, and I'm not sure who did it. It was so long ago. But you bring up a very good point, because one of the questions is how do you feel about stories of people being tortured, etc., along those lines, and can you empathize with that? So I'm beginning to wonder if you're right on the mark there about some of what's being inflicted is the equivalent of a galactic taken behind the barn and spank 'em sort of thing, for lack of a better way of putting it. But is it more of a teaching approach?
It is, I think, a teaching approach. There is this transformation. The thing that is so interesting to me is that experiencers have all of the symptoms of near-death experiencers. And that was part of this Omega 1 and 2 study. They had two groups, one near-death experiencers and one UFO abduction experiencers. And then they also had a third group of people from the general population. And so compared the results of these groups. And it makes me wonder. I've talked to 3 physicists about this, people with PhDs, and what I asked is it indeed scientifically possible for experiencers to be taken through a solid surface, such as a wall or a ceiling or even a glass window. So many people have said they have been taken directly through. And so the scientists all said, yes, it is possible. They said, theoretically, everything has a vibrational frequency. And when you have that vibrational frequency, if you can line up the frequency and the mode, then atoms can interpenetrate. So in so many of the early hypnosis sessions that were carried out, the experiencers, when they were taken into this beam, felt as if they were coming apart. And I'm wondering if this is a kind of thing where they do undergo a near-death experience through this process, or if this is something that is just imparted to them on the craft. I don't have the answer, but the scientists told me, remember, 99.9% of the atom is empty space. And so theoretically it is possible, and we have even done it in a laboratory using neutrinos, which are very tiny. So we're far behind them. But if they're, 500 years, 1,000 years ahead of us, what kind of technological developments have they made? Well, they've certainly learned how to get here, and I don't think that they're coming over generations. I think that they have developed methodology where they can bend space or travel through wormholes.
Wow. All right, we're going to go ahead and take us a quick break, be about 6-7 minutes, something like that. So give you time to stretch your legs. And Kathleen, just remember your mic will be live. Just either mute your mic or don't say anything. You'll hear it when we come back on. With that, Jeff, you still with us?
Yep. Oh, yeah. Well, I dropped off a couple of times, but,
Well, why don't you take us out then?
Well, you're listening to the Paranormal View on para-x.com with hosts Henry Foister, Ceiling Cat Barbara Duncan, and myself, Jeffrey Gould, with tonight's guest, Kathleen Marden. So stay tuned for more of the Paranormal View after the break.
Whether you're listening at home, at work, or anywhere, thanks for making Para-X part of your day. Your source for everything paranormal, Para-X.
And welcome back, everybody, right here to the Paranormal View on the Para-X Radio Network. I want to thank everyone for being with us tonight. Hope you are enjoying the show. Tonight we have with us Barbara Duncan.
Good evening, everyone.
And we have Jeffrey Gould.
Hello.
And speaking of listeners from around the world, where do we have listeners tonight?
Henry, tonight they're listening in from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Poland, Puerto Rico, Spain, Belgium, Thailand, Australia just popped in, and our little friend from the unknown.
All right. Well, we got a lot tonight then.
Yeah.
And no wonder we have a great guest tonight. We have Kathleen Marden with us.
And I'm happy to be with you.
Well, I am glad you are here. Very interesting. I've got some questions already from the chat room. And
okay.
This one here is from Tabby Cat. And she wanted to know, do you think that making films such as Fire in the Sky hurts or lends more credibility to abductions like what happened to Travis Walton?
Well, I know that Travis was very unhappy with that movie because they turned it into a horror movie. And so it causes people to become terrified of the non-human visitors. And, I know that some of them have a bad reputation. They're not very nice to humans, but the majority are not that way. And when it is portrayed as a horror story in the media, it makes a lot of money. Fear sells. But the impact that has on the population is to be terrified if they see a UFO, and terrified that they're going to be picked up by a UFO. They're probably not, because these entities pretty much have the people that they're working with, and they've been working with generations of abductees, contactees, whatever you want to call them, experiencers, for generations. So,
I thought we dropped you there.
No. I'm looking at a statistic here. One of the things that we asked is, what was the demeanor of the entities? Were they businesslike? Were they kind? Were they, evil, hostile, that sort of thing? Well, 65% of the abductees said that they were businesslike, 48% of the experiencers, but less than 6% said that they were hostile or sadistic. So, it's unfortunate that there is a small percentage, but that appears to be the focus of the television movie media.
Wow. Well, I had another question, and it was about the star map.
Mm-hmm.
When I guess they give her the star map, but she didn't remember it until it was under hypnosis.
Oh, it was on the wall.
She seen it on the wall.
What happened? Let me explain. Because there are so many false stories out there that people become confused. So I'll tell you what really happened. After Betty's examination was finished, she began to trust the leader because the examiner had done something to her that caused pain. And the leader took her pain away. So the examiner went in to examine Barney. There was only one on the craft, but, they were all set up to do these exams. And so Betty decided that she would speak with the leader. And she said to him, "Well, I know you're not from around here. Where's your home port?" And so he produced this three-dimensional star map. She's described it as like looking out a window. Later on, she said it might have been a hologram, but when she saw it, we didn't even have holograms. And and she did have a dream too. One of those 5 dreams that started 10 days after the experience. She had only 5, and some of those dreams were things she remembered. Some of the dreams were things she hadn't remembered. But in the dream, the entities didn't look like the ones I've described. They had black hair and looked very human and were wearing blue cadet uniforms, so totally different. But in the dream as well, Betty was shown a star map that pulled down from like the ceiling, just like in a 1961 classroom anywhere in America. And so that was the dream. But when she remembered this under hypnosis, it was she saw it in 3 dimensions. And there were 2 stars in the foreground, one the size of a quarter, one probably closer to the size of a nickel. And then there were 4 more stars that were connected by solid lines. One of them ended up being our son, but she didn't know it at the time. 2 lines to that, 2 lines to 2 others, and 3 lines to 1 other, and then 5 lines between the 2 large stars in the foreground. Also, there were other stars that were connected by dotted lines. And then there were 3 stars that were not connected at all. The dotted lines, Betty understood, were expeditions. Just maybe, I don't know if they'd ever been there or if it was just a plan to go there. And then, of course, there were the other 3 unconnected, so I guess no plans to go there at that point. So Betty, under hypnosis, remembered this star map, and Dr. Simon told her, gave her the post-hypnotic suggestion that if she could remember it accurately, and if it didn't bother her too badly, that she could go home and draw it and then bring it back in to him to show him. So she did. She went home and she drew it. Fortunately, she had a photographic memory, but she was a little worried about perspective. I can't imagine trying to just put a 3-dimensional map on paper, but that's what she did. And a woman from Ohio, a brilliant woman by the name of Marjorie Fish, saw that star map in the first book that was ever written as a result of, well, it came about because Betty and Barney's story went public as the result of a violation of confidentiality in 1965. It was just devastating to them. And then they agreed to permit a professional writer to write their story. And so that map was in that book. Marjorie Fish purchased the book, saw the map, and she was an amateur astronomer. So she wondered that if this star system, these stars, are somewhere in our local galactic neighborhood out 54 light years from our sun, would she be able to find them? And so she went to the university. She couldn't take the astronomical catalogs out. She had to sit and copy the distance data by hand and all of the characteristics of those stars as well as the distance data. And then she would take the distance data home, and using beads of various sizes and colors and monofilament line and a 3-dimensional frame, she constructed star maps in all directions from our sun, out 54 light years. In all, she constructed 14 over 4 years, and she still didn't have a match. So in the interim, while she was doing this, she was talking to Betty, writing to Betty, going to New Hampshire from Ohio to visit Betty and interview her. So she finally went to the university again in 1972, and a new astronomical catalog had been released. And there was new distance data because our astronomers were able to more precisely estimate the data, the distance data between the sun and those stars. And so Marjorie Fish used all of the new information in those new catalogs and went back and rearranged some of the stars with the new distance data, and then put 3 stars on that hadn't been there in the first attempt, the first 13 or 14 attempts. They were now known to be within 54 light years of our sun. And she had a match. So the next problem was how was she going to find anyone who, any scientist who would vet her work? And so Coral Lorenzen from APRO, I mentioned that earlier, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, got in touch with Stanton Friedman. He was a member of that group, and she asked him if he was going to leave from California and go to Ohio to speak. At that time, he had just begun speaking, and he was about finished with his work as a nuclear physicist. And so Stanton agreed to meet with Marjorie. And when he went to Ohio to lecture, he stopped by, he interviewed her. He told me that he was very impressed with Marjorie, that he felt that she was more comfortable speaking with scientists than to the general population. And as a result of the conversation and the models that she showed him, the meticulous work that she had done, he said that he would find scientists to vet her work. And he did. One of those scientists was Dr. Alan Hynek. And he was the astronomical consultant for Project Blue Book, who then later went on to form the Center for UFO Studies and was teaching as an astronomy professor at Northwestern University and was the director of the observatory there. And so he and Stanton and Marjorie took her model and explained the work to him. He looked everything over and did the calculations and said he was impressed with her work. It was accurate. Another one, a little bit later, was from the Ohio State University, and his name was Walter Mitchell. And his class used computers and did computer-generated models and discovered that Marjorie's map was accurate. So there was a lot of accuracy there. There was another one who did a statistical analysis and said that there was one chance in 1,000 that Betty could have sketched this just as coincidence and had this star pattern identified. And then other astronomers who looked at this were impressed because they said that if they were spacefaring astronauts going from Zeta Reticuli, they would travel to the stars that these entities from Zeta Reticuli came from. So, and Zeta Reticulum is it's a constellation, the constellation the Net, and it's in the southern hemisphere. It cannot be seen from the northern hemisphere, and is very dim from the southern hemisphere. 38 light years away from our sun, and 39 and a half light years from our sun. And so a very long distance. Alpha Mensae is on it. Our sun is on that map. 82 Arendani is on the map. And Gliese 86 is on the map. So all sun-like stars.
Wow.
And, you know, that was quite a coincidence that all of these stars are sun-like stars, even though 5% of the stars in that portion of our galactic neighborhood are sun-like. And all of the sun-like stars were on Betty's map. Not only that, but they were in a plane, like pepperoni on a pizza, as opposed to raisins spread out through a loaf of raisin bread. So that meant since they were on this plane, that it would be easier. They would not be traveling long distances from one to the other. So it made sense logically to the astronomers who really studied this.
It would be interesting to go back now and see, since we have the technology, how many of those systems have Goldilocks planets around them.
Absolutely. And in the 60th anniversary edition of my book, Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience with Stanton Friedman, the late great Stanton Friedman, that is going to be released soon. And you can even purchase it from my website now. I have purchased copies already. My website is Kathleen-Marden, MARDEN.com. But there has been an update by an astrophysicist on Betty's star map. Very interesting.
Wow.
Yeah, it's on Amazon now, and it is riveting, folks. You really want to purchase this book.
Yeah, I purchased it. They just said I can't get it till the 1st of April sometime.
Well, the link
Yes.
will be on the report page, and that'll be on the Paranormal View Facebook page. So yeah.
It's even going to be sold at Walmart and Target. I was surprised when I
Wow.
saw that.
Awesome.
Yes.
Wow.
I guess my next question is, with the latest congressional action that requires the government to start releasing more information, have you been able to uncover any evidence that may have been hidden from your current research or previous research concerning Benny and Barney's abduction?
No, I haven't. And I have to tell you that I know that when this story went public back in 1966, the Betty's and Barney's file was sent from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where Project Blue Book was located, to the Pentagon. So I know that there was great interest in them at that time. And in the book, I wrote about two Air Force officers who were did a graduate work, had to write a thesis, and the thesis they wrote was, should Project Blue Book be reopened? And they discussed the case, and they had information that I was, and no one else was able to find. So, and that is in my book, Captured, as well. So you'll be able to read that there. But fascinating. It's a fascinating case. I have absolutely loved doing my investigation and research on this for now 31 years. And there is an update of the new scientific analyses of the evidence, as well as science has moved along, as our technological development has moved along. There have been new discoveries on that dress, and because I can't tell you what they are, you have to buy the book to read that chapter.
Well, I will soon.
Well, I hope it arrives soon.
Now, did they happen to tell her roughly maybe how long it took them to travel from these places to here?
No, all the leader said to her is, do you know where you are on this map? And she said, no, I know nothing about the universe. And he said to her, if you don't know where you are, how can I tell you where I am? Which I thought was pretty deceptive. He could have just said, that's where this is your sun. You're on one of the planets revolving around the sun, and this is where we're from. But he didn't bother with that. He just put that map away.
No.
Wow.
Didn't she make a comment?
Yeah, that always drove me a little nuts. All I could think of is, they just need a little "You Are Here" tag on it.
Well,
They
didn't Betty
should.
make a comment about she thought that the leader thought she was stupid?
No,
Okay.
no, she did not. She never said that to me. Um, they were interested in what she had to say, but he didn't tell her she was stupid because
Okay.
she didn't know where. No, they
I-
didn't
Oh, okay.
insult her.
Yeah, I always thought it was a case of, if she had no frame of reference, it would be pointless to try and explain it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, true.
hmm
All
But
right.
he could have. Yes, but he could have
Oh,
pointed
yeah.
that out,
Oh, well, yeah.
and he decided not to.
Well, he just thought she was a muggle, so there you go.
Well, I guess it's a question of where they think that humans are in the level of development, whether or not they wanted to give away where they think they're from, just in case we did have some sort of big explosion of technology and could finally find them.
I know.
Better to not know.
Stanton Friedman always used to say they wanted to quarantine us. So, maybe that was why
That's possible. Yeah.
they didn't tell Betty.
All right. All I can do is tell the people to buy this book. It is an excellent book. And if you buy the newer one, has all this other extra added information in it and the expanded version. So the book is captured. Now I want to talk a little bit about Kathleen. You have also been abducted. Why don't you tell us a little bit about this?
Well, I don't enjoy talking about it, but I can tell you that when my grandparents had that craft land in their yard, it landed within 200 feet of my childhood home, and my mother and I remembered being taken to the craft. We were very traumatized by the experience. Dr. James Harder worked with both of us, hypnotized us, and so I really did have post-traumatic stress disorder for many years because periodically I would be taken again, and I had memories. I had conscious recall of part of it, and I was awake when it happened, when I remembered it, and I had a really difficult time overcoming that. It wasn't until probably 10 years ago when I had hypnosis by an individual who was very kind and gentle and not looking for the information that researchers looked for, but just wanted to assist me in overcoming this fear. And I became part of a support group as well. And it really, really helped. I lost my fear. I'm, as you said earlier, I'm a hypnosis practitioner. I decided to do that because I had written a paper way back in the 90s on hypnosis, all of the academic studies that I could find. And I thought, well, it would be good if I could do this practically as well. And so I hypnotized myself. I gave myself keywords that we use in hypnosis for rapid induction. And by doing that, I use it when I can't fall asleep at night. But if entities come into my environment, then I can give myself this rapid induction by saying 3 words to myself, and I become very calm and relaxed. And so it really helped me a lot. And I have no memory of having a hybrid children. I do have a memory of being shown tubes, very, very large tubes, cylinders that had kind of a, I don't know, a greenish, grayish fluid that I thought was viscous. And there were fetuses developing in those. I don't know if they were grays or if they were humans or what they were. I just remember being shown those. I was treated well, very nicely, respectfully, and I finally overcame my fear. And during my hypnosis sessions, I remembered them calming me and telling me, we won't harm you. You have nothing to be afraid of. We love you. And they weren't just saying love, they were throwing love. And that's what they do. I've found out since in these studies that they actually project love out to experiencers. And it's the most profound love. It's greater than human love. So, that really helps to overcome one's fear of what is occurring.
So why do you think aliens keep abducting people and I'll say testing on them?
Well, I know for one thing, they take the core samples, the little punch biopsy type samples. They say that they're doing this to test the human body for toxicity. That's one thing they told me way back when I lived in Kingston, New Hampshire, and I was 17 years old, and I was taken with my mother. And it makes sense to me now because I grew up just downstream, less than a mile away from what ended up being a Superfund site. There were neurotoxins leaching into the lake near my house and into the well water of the people who lived there. All of the children were born with learning disabilities. And I was close to 2 nuclear installations, Pease Air Force Base and also the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard that was building nuclear submarines. So
Wow.
that makes perfect sense to me. They also have told other experiencers that they are doing this hybridization process, not only with humans, but with all animals and plant life as well, all flora and fauna, sort of like Noah's Ark. They use this material when they terraform other planets, and so that life can live on those planets. And they are also keeping it so that if we destroy this planet, they will have all of that DNA. They seem to be masters at DNA.
Wow.
And I always wondered if that hybridization program was even possible, because how could they mix human DNA with their own? Either they're doing some kind of gene splicing, or they are us in the future, or somehow related to us.
Wow.
Or is there another planet with humans on it that we simply just don't know about yet?
Well, there could be. There very much could be. I worked on a case that I found incredibly interesting because it was 3 people who were taken, and along with being taken, they were there doing research as paranormal researchers with all kinds of cameras and equipment and a motion picture camera. And craft came in, and it was next to the moon, and they saw it coming in fast, and they were trying to communicate with it. It was kind of a CE5 experiment. And the next thing they knew, the things that they were holding in their hands were no longer there. they were reeling back and forth and feeling nauseated. They went into the experiencer's house, and his wife was there and said, "Where have you been? I've been looking for you, and you weren't there." And they were amazed that it was now 1 o'clock in the morning. They were missing nearly 2 hours time. And long story short, two of those experiencers met up with human types on that craft and were informed that they had once lived on our planet hundreds of thousands of years ago, that there had been an environmental collapse here, and that they had the technology to move on. Very few did. The others most people had to stay here and die, or except for those who maybe were not affected by the environmental collapse and there was still vegetation and animals. But these humans went on, they found a planet, they said, that is in twilight most of the time, but they were able to settle there, and they just come back to our planet to check on our development periodically. They don't take anything from us, they said, but they were us at one time on this planet.
So when you say humanoids, you mean like Nordics?
They looked very much like Nordics. They had kind of light brown hair, long hair.
Yeah.
They were wearing a certain chevron emblem on their uniforms. There were men and women. Pardon me?
I said I didn't know they had corporate sponsors. Sorry.
So a very interesting case with a lot of evidence, because that video camera did not shut off immediately, and they were able to capture video of the non-humans coming into the human environment on a blue beam and dropping off that beam and hitting the ground.
Wow.
Pretty amazing. Very amazing.
That would be interesting, I guess, and to think about stuff like that.
Yes. And the experiencers have copyrighted all of that film, but they have given me permission to show it at the conferences that I speak at this year. So I know that, I'm hoping that 2 conferences are going to be on. They're planning it. If I can't do it this year, I'll have to do it next year, but I do have permission from them to introduce them to America and the rest of the world, I guess, and to show their film.
So where's these hopefully 2 conferences going to be at this year?
Well, I'm going to be speaking at the Roswell UFO Festival over the 4th of July. And we think it's a go. We're expecting a large crowd. We've been vaccinated and are ready to go, even if we have to wear masks. And then the other one is in northern Michigan. And if you go to my website at Kathleen-Marden, MARDEN.com, I have a section on the menu at the top that says conferences or speaking engagements, something like that. Just click on that and you'll see the conferences that I am aware of that are so far on for this year. I know a lot of people aren't having conferences. They're just thinking about doing online conferences, but these people are hoping to have physical conferences, and I just can't wait. I just love working at conferences, lecturing, showing my PowerPoint presentations, and speaking to the people who come to my vendor table, because most of them have had their own UFO sightings or contact experiences, or they're scientists who are very interested in the topic.
Wow.
And I just put those links in chat, so
Okay,
those of you in chat, you can see that.
great.
So
Thank you.
Las Vegas, Nevada, in July.
Well, the MUFON was planning one at
Mhm.
Las Vegas, and but it isn't on MUFON's website anymore. So I
Oops.
don't know
Yep.
what's going on. I looked at the website today,
Hmm.
and it wasn't there. And so I guess stay tuned.
Well,
I think I did.
Thomas.
I think I had MUFON up there, but I just heard that they had taken it down.
Ah,
So maybe it's on and maybe it's not.
Hmm.
I
COVID.
don't plan on going there this year because I'm not a speaker, and so I would, have to pay. And since since I haven't
know
been
what that's like.
working, I can't do hypnosis sessions. I can't speak at conferences. My income is pretty much gone, except for the television shows that I've been on.
I know what you mean there. That's for sure. I haven't. I also do paranormal investigations, and I get to go to places and do my show live and stuff like that. And I haven't done anything since 2019. I think the
Yes.
last
Yeah.
one we did was in Gettysburg in 2019. That's been it.
Yes, and the last live conference that I did was in 2019,
Yeah.
and
So,
every one of them was canceled for 2021. I mean 2020,
yeah.
and unfortunately, I did speak at 3 virtual conferences online,
Mm,
but that was it.
wow. I didn't even know they had those.
I had my own in July.
I know more about it now. Oh, one of the other questions I wanted to ask you was about their car. That there was a spot on there that become like magnetized to where if you put something there, the compass would just spin wildly. Did they keep their car for a long time, or did they get it refixed, or whatever happened to
Well,
that car?
Betty's daughter and her husband were being transferred from Pease Air Force Base to another Air Force base. They purchased the car from Betty when Betty bought a new car. And then they ended up selling it when they purchased a new car. No one has ever been able to trace what happened to that car. And I have to tell you, I have been contacted by so many classic car enthusiasts who would love to get their hands on that car, but we've never been able to find it.
Hmm.
A
Wow.
57 Chevy? Yeah, a lot
Yeah.
of people would.
Mhm.
Oh, yes, very popular.
Wow.
Especially one that, with its reputation.
Yes, absolutely. It would probably be worth a lot of money, but I have a feeling that it's probably been in a scrapyard somewhere.
But you have to, it would make a very interesting study just to see the long-term effects of extraterrestrial technology affecting human technology. I'm assuming that there is a similar chemical makeup with the same metals, the same gemstones, the same elements that are all over the universe. But how they've managed to manipulate it would be fascinating.
Yes, yes, their metamaterials are fascinating.
Well, the
In
fact
that,
that
go ahead.
there was so much on her dress that also stayed in the dress, but simply didn't affect it. It seemed like. With the
Well,
exception,
it did pit the dress.
it did pit it. Okay.
Yes, it did pit it. And so there has been many analyses on the pink part of her dress as compared to the blue part of her dress. The pink part was the part that something grew on, and it has undergone scientific analysis 8 or 10 times now. The dress is now housed at the University of New Hampshire archival collection. And so just recently, scientists have done analysis on the dress and have new findings that are in the new book, the 60th anniversary edition, as well. And
so get that so you can read it.
you can read it. It's fascinating. But with that pink powder, I spoke with one scientist who was very interested. He was a PhD plant scientist, and he said to me, "I know what happened to that dress," and he said it was sterilized. They used some kind of sterilization agent on that dress, and it killed all of the bacteria and viruses, anything that was on it. And the extraterrestrials transferred from their hands the yeast, he thinks it's yeast, onto the dress when they wrapped their very long fingers around her shoulders and under her arms to escort her. And when they removed the dress, it dropped to the floor. So the hem area is heavily saturated with that pink powdery substance, and and the sleeves of the dress. The bodice area around her waist is not saturated at all. It's just blue. So, but he thinks that yeast grew on it and then died when its life cycle was over. There was nothing more to feed on, and that it was transferred from these entities. And by coincidence, their dog Delcy developed a fungus infection on her back. After that, she was with them in the car, and she was a little dachshund. And Barney's clothing was sent to the dry cleaners immediately. He was wearing a suit, tie, shirt, and so it didn't develop a pink powdery substance. By the time they unzipped his fly, they knew how to unzip a zipper. They'd already destroyed Betty's, so she showed them how.
That's funny.
Yeah. No, I find that yeah. Forensically, it's perfect because you've explained it now as to how the dress came off and landed. It would make complete forensic sense why there's nothing on the bodice, but on the hem and the
Yes, and other scientists agree that they believe that. And Phyllis Budinger from Ohio is an analytical chemist. She has a master's degree in chemistry and worked for BP Amoco, and formerly Standard Oil, for 30 years, I believe it was. And Phyllis did an extensive analysis on Betty's dress and said at the end that Betty's statements about what happened with the dress were consistent with Phyllis's findings on the dress. And of course, she also did a spectroscopic analysis and believes that there is some kind of a fungus, biological substance that deposited on that dress. And I guess it's impossible to identify precisely what it is now, but very interesting nevertheless.
So, just real quick, because we're running out of time, did they leave the dog in the car, or did the dog go with them on the spaceship?
Well, Betty and Barney didn't see the dog on the craft, and the dog was in the car when Barney reached the car. And so Betty and Barney thought that she was left in the car.
Wow. pretty interesting, though.
Dachshunds are oddly enough can be very protective and aggressive that way. So the possibility you're like, okay, we're going to leave that one alone.
I don't know if Delcy would have been like that or not, but they could have paralyzed her, or she may have tried to run out of the car and they could have picked her up and stroked her and put her back in. That could be how she developed that fungus infection, but we'll never know because she was a new dog to Betty and Barney. They didn't know if she'd ever had a fungus infection prior to that time.
Other than Barney and Betty Hill, what is one of the other lesser known but a really good case that you had to investigate?
Well, aside from the one that I talked about with the people who caught the entities on camera, I have, Denise Stoner is one. There's a woman whose case I investigated when I lived in New Hampshire that I wrote about in the Alien Abduction Files. It's another one of my books with Denise. She wrote about her own take on her experience as well in that book. And I wrote Extraterrestrial Contact, What to Do When You've Been Abducted. And I talked about a few of my other fascinating cases, ranging from very benevolent to very evil, you might say, not benevolent at all.
Wow.
So it runs the gamut, and I wanted a well-rounded perspective in the book. So I only have a couple of minutes. How much time do I have to tell about it?
No, not really, because we're going to be wrapping up. Okay. We ain't got 2 minutes left. However,
which means we're going to have you back.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Or you can just purchase those books. And
yes.
Read the story now.
We can do that, but we'd like to have you back on too sometime.
Well, I would love to come back on again sometime.
Right.
Thanks for inviting me.
I
have to say, the first time I saw the whole title of Extraterrestrial Contact, What to Do When You've Been Abducted, it reminded me of a kind of brochure Homer Simpson would pick up saying, "Oh, so you've been abducted by aliens."
A lot of people were apprehensive about purchasing that because it said you've been abducted on it. And the envelopes that I send the books in are not very good. I have to tape them. And I've had people contact me and say, thank you for taping the envelope so that no one could open it and see what I was ordering.
Wow. All right. We want you to give out where people can reach you again, and if you're doing anything soon. And then we want you to stay on till we're off, and we'll talk with you for a minute.
Okay, sure. Well, you can go to my website at Kathleen-Marden, MARDEN.com, and I have a lot of things on the website, including contact Kathleen. I have consultations. You can book a 1-hour consultation with me. I am so overwhelmed with work that I cannot speak with anyone on the phone because I receive dozens of requests every week. I just couldn't do it any longer. So the people who are willing to pay for a consultation can speak with me.
All right. With that, we're going to see you next week at the same time. We'll have Thomas Wortman as a guest. So until then, this is Henry Foister.
And
Barbara Duncan.
All right. We'll see you next week at the same time. So good night, everybody. You've been listening to the Paranormal View on the ParaX Radio Network. Join us again next week at the same time for more of the Paranormal